On this special edition of Independent Sources, a day of mourning, why more indigenous people are not celebrating one of the U.S.'s most treasured holidays, and Yankee Thanksgiving, tracing the holiday's history to the Civil War rather than Plymouth Rock. Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. Thanksgiving is almost upon us again, marking the beginning of the holiday season. For many, it's a time for mirth and merriment. But increasingly, more indigenous people in the United States see the holiday as a time for mourning. Many Native Americans now recognize the last Thursday of November as the National Day of Mourning. Abby Ishola spoke with Roberto Mercado Borrero, president of the United Confederation of Taino People, to learn more about the history of the day.
Welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much.
So tell us a little bit about the history behind the Day of the Mourning.
Well, the Day of Mourning is an alternative to what most people see as the Thanksgiving holiday. Actually, back around 1970, there was a local Native American man who was invited to give a speech at a gathering in Massachusetts near Plymouth. And when he sent his speech over there, the organizers saw that he was really talking about the true history of what happened and the need for reconciliation. And they didn't think that message was the proper message to give at that type of gathering. So they sent him another speech already prepared on what he should say.
Wow.
So when that happened, he declined to participate in that event. And along with other people, they decided to organize a protest, a national day of mourning, to remember and reflect on the genocide and the atrocities and the continual suffering of indigenous peoples here in the United States and beyond.
Wow. So how has the movement grown since then?
Well, I think that the gathering itself continues to be a large gathering. There is another West Coast gathering called Indigenous Peoples Day that also happens the same day on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco. And I think that, with those type of East and West Coast activities, it kind of gives you an idea that it's grown since the 70s. Mainstream media has not picked it up as well as it should be picked up. It hasn't made a big enough difference in the schools. Kids are still learning the erroneous history around Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and their interactions with Native Americans. And so there's still a lot of work to be done.
So what does the community want the general public to know about Thanksgiving?
Well, first of all, I think if you really look at the history during that time, and you could see this even when we talk about Columbus or anything, there's a certain view that's kind of portrayed to the mainstream, and that deals with, okay, we've come to a place and here we are, and we've made this great America. But in making that great America, people don't want to acknowledge the robbery of native lands, genocide against native peoples, enslavement of Africans, right? All these things don't fit into this really neat portrayal of how America came to be the great power that it is. And so when you look at stories like Thanksgiving, there's a real need for education. And I think that if you study the situation of indigenous peoples here in the United States and throughout the Americas, you see that it wasn't a very just transition between who was controlling lands and resources when 1492 happened, or when Pilgrims came over, or when Jamestown happened. It wasn't a just transition, right? To the way that the land was being cared for by Native peoples, to what happened when the Europeans came over here. And that relationship, that very tense relationship, still it has not been resolved. Really, how do these peoples deal? Native peoples had a certain vision, right? Which is why they entered into treaties, etc., with Europeans coming over here as they were settling. But if you look at what they call the Trail of Broken Treaties, really no treaty has been honored from the time of their entering into. So when you talk about the day of mourning, it's really a time for reflection. It's a time for education. It's a time for Native peoples also to come together spiritually and think about what values that they want to incorporate into their lives. You know, and they're making a stand, right? They're saying, look, we're not going to participate in this satirized version of history that you call, you know, the Thanksgiving celebration. We want to really focus on the situation of Native peoples and, you know, where we're at today.
Yeah. So how diverse are the people who participate in the actual day of mourning?
Well, I think that in the beginning it was a very local affair because it has to do, you know, it was in Massachusetts, Plymouth Rock. So you had the United American Indian Tribes of New England, the organization, coming together with those local peoples, Pequots, Narragansetts, Wampanoags, etc. And but since then it's grown, and you know, they're not only talking about injustices to Native American peoples, they're talking about injustices to all peoples of color or quote unquote minorities, right? So you know, in these dialogues that happen during these days, we're not only looking at the history and the relationship between American Indians and the United States government, but we're also looking at the current situation of other peoples as well, police brutality, and many other issues. So it has widened in scope. Even the immigration issue, right? It's all coming into it, and we see participation by many other communities coming to support these days' events.
Has there been any resistance to the actual day of mourning?
There's always resistance, right? There's always a resistance because folks want that, you know, perfect presentation. They don't really look at, they don't really want to look at, it seems like, the majority. And, you know, this is, I guess, affirmed by the lack of understanding it in the mainstream media. Right? You're not seeing these stories. When is the last time that we're seeing footage from the day of mourning on your local television stations outside the New England area, or you know, something maybe in the New York Times about it, et cetera. So there is a resistance in the fact that children continue to be taught about a mythology interaction between the Pilgrims and Native Americans really shows that even at that core level, when children should be given an accurate representation of history to really inform the decisions and break down stereotypes and racist ideals and white supremacist ideals, you know, at the core, that's what it is. They're not given that education. They're not given that equitable start from the beginning. So it kind of sets them up to look at life and look at life here in the United States in a certain way. And then later on, as they get older and they get to college or maybe into high school and they find other versions of history, you know, this sets up kind of quandaries in the mind, right? And then, you know, and resulting in books like Lies My Teacher Told Me and of that nature.
Absolutely. Robert Macaro, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Still to come on the show, breaking stereotypes about Native Americans. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. El Diario La Prensa reports that an estimated 2.1 million New Yorkers fall victims to wage theft every year. That number amounts to $3.2 million in earnings and benefits. The Center for Popular Democracy Action, or CPDA, recently released a report which suggests that employers resort to methods such as doctoring time clocks and reducing workers' tips. The Internal Revenue Service estimates that employers throughout the country misclassify millions of employees to avoid paying federal taxes. The CPDA warns that recurring labor law violations will make it very difficult to tackle workers' rights in the future. There's concern amongst many store owners in Chinatown about a proposed bill that would require retail and grocery stores to charge per single-use plastic or paper bag. A contributor for Open City magazine describes how this proposed tax would affect many of the businesses that use red plastic bags in the community because they are seen as a symbol of good luck. Last year, a coalition of city council members, environmental advocates, and others held a rally to press for the passage of the 10-cent plastic bag tax in an effort to promote the usage of reusable bags. But that failed, and now they're asking for 5 cents. Opponents of the bill say that the bag fee will hurt low-income families and senior citizens. According to Bill 209, green markets or street vendors will not be required to charge the plastic bag fee. DNA Info reports on Bronx District Attorney-elect Darcel Clark's plan for dealing with several long-standing problems on Rikers Island. Her plans for reforming the city's troubled jail complex include setting up a Rikers Island task force where staffers will be trained to address issues specific to the prison, such as sexual assaults and narcotics trafficking. Additionally, she hopes to get a judge placed on Rikers Island to help expedite arraignments and other court proceedings involving cases at the jail. Clark was elected as the new Bronx District Attorney by a landslide this November. And finally, some other news from DNA Info. An artist just may have solved the Starbucks Holiday Cup controversy. Starbucks brewed up debate recently when it released its traditional red cups without their holiday-themed designs that have defined the brand since 1997. The backlash was enough for Starbucks to release a statement saying that the design was meant to encourage customers to use the new cup as a canvas of sorts. Artist Richard Herrera, who works as a video editor and motion graphics designer for Marvel Comics, used the canvas to create his own holiday collection. Herrera started with a quick sketch of Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas and has moved up to other pop culture touchstones such as The Simpsons, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Charlie Brown, and Frosty the Snowman. Those were just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent Sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. November is Native American Month, a fact that's often lost amidst the pomp and celebration around Thanksgiving. There's a growing effort to educate Americans about marking the month and teaching more people about indigenous culture in general. Debbie Reese is the editor and publisher of American Indians and Children's Literature and tribally enrolled at Nambe Pueblo in northern New Mexico. Zafis LeBrun spoke to her via Skype.
Debbie Reese, thank you so much for joining us today on Independent Sources.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Debbie, let's just talk a little bit about Thanksgiving and what you're trying to do with your blog, American Indians and Children's Literature. How important it is, do you think, for children to kind of get a sense of what really happened at Thanksgiving rather than that kind of whitewash, which has kind of been, historically been presented to children in the United States?
I think that this country that we all live in, where a guiding phrase is "we the people," kind of says "we the people," but not "you people." You can be in our story, and we'll tell you how to be in that story. That's not justice. That's not education. That's not equity or fair to anyone. It's miseducation. It's misrepresentation. And so I think the story ought to be told as correctly, as accurately as we can do it.
In your blog, you mentioned a number of different stories, and one of the things that spoke out to me was the fact that, in telling the story, it said that the Native American who assisted the Pilgrims was seen as he was an assistant to them, but at the end, he's sent off to slavery in Spain. Are you trying to kind of, highlight those sorts of things with the work that you're doing, those sorts of inequities, if you will?
Sure. I think that's important that we know that Squanto was not just this wonderful man who knew how to speak English and help the Pilgrims. He knew how to speak English because of a dark history in which Europeans came here. He was lured onto a ship and then sent over to another country to be enslaved. I think that's an important part of our history, and students ought to know that. We should know that dark side of our history.
In the process of doing that, in the process of telling these stories, I mean, have you encountered resistance from people who say, well, listen, you know what, it's kind of, we want to tell this traditional story rather than telling this bigger story, if you will?
Oh, yes, absolutely. People don't like anyone to poke at their dearly held stories. Thanksgiving is one of the more difficult ones to actually work with. One of my colleagues in California had death threats when she asked that the students in her daughter's class not reenact the Thanksgiving dinner. They canceled the event, and then they had to put it back on, and CNN covered, MSNBC. It's one of the most significant stories that is mistold. And so, yes, the resistance is huge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you encountered any yourself personally, like your friend you mentioned?
I have encountered resistance when I've spoken up about, in particular, mascots, because I got my graduate degree at the University of Illinois, and there was an Indian mascot there. When I do talks, and on my blog too, when I talk about anything that people hold dear, Little House on the Prairie is a good example. The resistance that I get is quite palpable. I don't put the curse and threatening kinds of email comments onto my blog because that's not saying anything. But yeah, absolutely, we've been the target of a lot of that kind of resistance, my family.
Hmm. Do you feel that this is sort of like a personal mission for you to spread the word about what really happened, from the perspective of Native Americans at Thanksgiving?
I was raised in a traditional Pueblo Indian community, and one of the teachings that we were given was that we do for others, not for ourselves. So we live our life in a way that works for the entire community. That means not just my Pueblo community, but the state of New Mexico, the country of the U.S., the world population, because we all can be a better place. And so I don't know that I call it a personal mission. It's just a value that I have, that I'm a teacher, and teaching is what I do.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a movement going around the country where it seems that indigenous people are having a greater voice. There's been a call for Columbus Day to no longer be celebrated in certain areas, and in certain states it hasn't. Is what you're doing with with your blog and so forth, and what your friends doing? Is this part of like a bigger movement? Do you feel of getting indigenous people to be recognized? Their struggles to be more recognized.
I think so. I think we've seen gains in more recent years that we didn't have prior to the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. And I think social media actually is allowing us to make networks that are more productive in terms of organizing and pushing back on some of those things.
To get into some more specifics, you have mentioned actually several books in your blog that you think are great reads for young readers, and even people like myself who want to learn more about Native Americans and so forth. So your list of reads include The People Shall Continue. That's by Simon Ortiz. Could you talk a little bit about that book?
Sure. I like Simon's work in general. He's done a lot. He's read at the White House. He is one of our most esteemed scholars and poets in American Indian Studies. And he's Pueblo, so, it's more same general area that I'm from. But the People Shall Continue starts with that idea that there's over 500 different tribes, and we all have different ways of dressing and speaking. All our material culture is different, and our origin stories are different because we are different. And so he starts with that. So right as soon as a teacher picks that book up and starts to use it, diversity just flows through that. It goes through contact when the British and the Dutch arrived here and what that meant, and then into war, and then into treaties. He doesn't shy away from any of those things that are parts of American history, not just American Indian history, but American history. They ought to be part of that curriculum. So he goes through that history, as dark as it is, and talks about survival, and that we all actually have to work together. Chicanos, African Americans, we all have to work together to fight the greed that is destroying America. And he published that book in 1977, and I think it's absolutely relevant today.
The other book on your list, Debbie, is the Jingle Dancer. Tell us about that one.
I love Jingle Dancer. It's a book that I wish that I had in my hands when my daughter was dancing for the first time. It is a story about how a community or a family comes together to help a child do something in her traditional culture that she hasn't done before. In this case, the jingle dance. How she visits people in her family to help her learn the dance and to put together her traditional dress for that dance. There's also a really important piece of that story is that it could be set in any neighborhood. The little girl lives in a suburb with pitched roofed houses and paved streets. She's wearing jeans and tennis shoes. It pushes against that idea that, only Indians, that Indians lived a long time ago, and the ones that still live today wear buckskin and feathers, because that's not the case. We wear our traditional clothes for certain times of the year, not every day. So that's another reason I really like that book is one of the characters is a lawyer. My daughter's in law school, how many ways can that book be perfect?
Right. The other one on the list here is How I Became a Ghost by Tim Tingle. Really, I like the cover on this book. Never judge a book by its cover, but tell us a little bit about this book.
Well, that's a wonderful book for many reasons as well. These are books by Native writers who know their people, know their history, know that culture, and they know what they want to share. Um, People like traditional Native stories because they think, we're mystical, we've got all this wonderful communing with nature and all of that. But there's a lot more to who we are than that. Our religions are part of our daily lives. And so Tim Tingle presents Choctaw religion and beliefs as part of the daily life. It's not like, ooh, shapeshifters. There's a panther. And there's How I Became a Ghost. It just is. It's not packed with all of that new agey kind of stuff that you see in way too many children's books.
Right. And finally, the on the list is We All Count. And this one is by Julie Flett, I believe. Tell us about that one.
Julie Flett is First Nations. She's Cree Métis, Canada. And her book makes the beautiful point that in spite of government efforts to kill the Indian and save the man and get rid of our indigenous languages, they persist. And her book is a bilingual text, so it has English in it and Cree. So it's a counting book for the very young that makes the point, too, that we're still here and we still speak our languages.
Now, can these books be found? Where can these books be found? Can they be found on Amazon, at your local bookstore?
Sure. Amazon, People Shall Continue is out of print, so you have to get that one from a used bookseller. But they are all they're easily available.
And is there a push by yourself and others to really try to get these books to be part of a sort of a curriculum that can be used in schools or around the country?
Yes, there are various efforts around the country where the curriculum is being designed to include those books. There's a couple of teacher reference books also that are out that can help teachers do that. All of these are kind of information is at my website, so I could go on and on. But
Absolutely, and that website for the audience is?
American Indians in Children's Literature.
All right. Well, Debbie, thank you so very much for your time today, and best of luck.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
When we come back, why the history of Thanksgiving as we know it is very different than we've been led to believe. Finally, from us. At the top of the show, we talk about why many indigenous people no longer celebrate Thanksgiving. We wanted to leave you with yet another version of the holiday. Columbia professor Carl Jacoby, who is a historian, has written about the day and explains that the Thanksgiving we celebrate may find its origins in the Civil War rather than the era of the Pilgrims. Here's my conversation with Professor Jacoby.
Dr. Jacoby, the narrative that we as Americans know about Thanksgiving is not quite accurate. You've written about. Can you tell us exactly how Thanksgiving came up to be?
So the actual Thanksgiving holiday as a federal holiday doesn't begin until 1863. And so 1863 is, of course, the middle of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And so it's very much a political holiday. Lincoln proclaims it because what he's trying to do is proclaim Thanksgiving for Union victories. Mm-hmm. And so this is why the food we eat is actually 19th century food. It's not what people would have eaten in the colonial period.
What would have they eaten?
In the colonial period? So the little bit that we know about early meals where they shared food with Native Americans in Plymouth was things like deer, duck, corn, eels, none of the things that show up in your traditional Thanksgiving holiday. Yeah, it's not clear they ate turkey at all, as a matter of fact.
And so what was Lincoln thinking about? Where did the connection between the 1600 and then the reality of the 1800 when this really actually started?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. So Thanksgiving, like I said, is very politicized. So the North has its Thanksgiving during the Civil War. The South then retaliates by having its own Thanksgiving during the Civil War for the Confederate victories. And then after the Civil War, there's a sense that this is an incredibly contentious holiday because is it celebrating the Union victories over the South, which of course most Southerners don't want to celebrate. And so what happens, it's part of this larger process, I'd say, of reconciliation where North and South are able to reconcile with one another. And the way they do that is by transposing Thanksgiving from the 19th century and from the Civil War and putting it all the way back into the colonial period and making it about this meal that did take place between Wampanoags and the settlers at Plymouth in the 1620s.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about Thanksgiving from a Southern standpoint, they call it the Yankee celebration. They refused to. So did they have the same date as the Northerners, or how did they celebrate it?
So, during the Civil War, I think they would celebrate it consciously at different days and trying to differentiate the two from one another. Then after the Civil War, it wasn't clear a lot of Southerners wanted to celebrate it at all. And then, but it was stayed as a federal holiday. And so this is why I think the imagery shifts, because there's so much of an effort to avoid the current contentious politics. And so it's interesting. So reconciliation between North and South after the Civil War, and we often think about how this is done at the expense of African Americans, because basically what happens is North and South come together, and the North is willing to sort of reconcile with the South and overlook segregation, overlook disenfranchisement of free people. And so reconciliation in many ways takes place on the backs of African Americans, but it also takes place on the backs of Native Americans. This whole sort of sanitized image of the first Thanksgiving takes a place of the actual political content of what took place.
Well, the sanitized version, as you put it, did it actually take place, or is it something that nations tend to fabricate narratives to bolster itself, to rally people, whatever? Is this the case here? Well,
so we do know that in the 1620s, the local Wampanoag people did have a meal which they shared with the settlers at Plymouth. We don't know that the settlers even called it Thanksgiving, that for a lot of the pilgrims coming from very puritanical religion, that for them a day of Thanksgiving was actually a day of fasting. So the idea that you would actually celebrate it with food and what they called at the time recreations with your Indian neighbors seems pretty unusual. And so what is interesting is that in the colonial period, when they do have days of Thanksgiving, they're often for things that we would much rather forget.
Such as?
Excellent. So right after King Philip's War, so the Indian leader, it's Massasoit, who brings his people to Plymouth to celebrate the so-called first Thanksgiving, if that's what we're going to call it. And then what's really interesting is what happens to Massasoit's son, King Philip, Menachem, after in 1675. There's actually a very brutal war where a lot of the Indians ally and try to push the settlers out of their land, realizing that settlers are here really not just to sort of be temporary visitors or just take a little land, but to really dispossess native peoples. And so there's a very brutal war, and after that war in 1676, the settlers do declare a day of Thanksgiving, but it's a day of Thanksgiving which isn't the sit down and celebrate with our Indian neighbors. It's a day of celebrating that we killed basically our Indian neighbors, and in fact, Metacom's head, they cut it off and they stick it on a pike outside of Plymouth, which is the location where the first Thanksgiving took place. And that's the other that is a story of Thanksgiving that we don't talk about very much.
The 1800, after Lincoln declared his holiday, how did that day become what it is today, where it's a massive feast where we overeat, we overdo everything? How did that come about?
In many ways, what happens is by projecting into this sort of fantasy image of the colonial past, it was able to depoliticize the event and make it about what it is today, which is really just time to be with family and friends. And it's not seen as a particularly political holiday at all. And so I think this sort of reimagining of its past is really crucial to that change.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we had to leave it there. Dr. Carl Jacoby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.